The alarm didn't sound like an alarm. It sounded like silence, the kind that comes when a system stops reporting because it no longer knows how to describe what it's seeing. Dr. Mireille Okafor noticed it first, not because she was the smartest person on Helios Station, though she was, but because she was the only one still awake at 0300 station time, running a diagnostic nobody had asked her to run. The solar telemetry feed had gone flat. Not dead, flat. As if something had reached into the sun's corona and told it to be quiet. She sat forward, fingers hovering over the console, and whispered the thing every scientist whispers when the universe stops making sense. That's not possible. Helios Station orbited close enough to Sol to taste its breath. A joint venture between Earth's fractured governments and the handful of alien trade partners who tolerated humanity, the way one tolerates a loud neighbor. Useful, occasionally, and always a little too much. Mireille had spent 6 years here studying stellar behavior nobody else cared about. Now the star she'd devoted her life to was doing something no star should do, and the silence in the room felt like a held breath. She pulled the raw signal apart, layer by layer, the way her mother had taught her to peel an orange in one long spiral, never breaking the skin. Buried under 70 years of encrypted noise was a signature she recognized only because she'd spent a summer, years ago, studying conquered diplomatic transmissions as an academic curiosity. Nobody at the university had taken it seriously. The Threnody Concord didn't speak to species like humanity. They spoke about them in rooms humans weren't invited into. This wasn't diplomatic traffic. This was infrastructure, a countdown, threaded so deep into background radiation that it looked like noise unless you already knew what you were looking for. By the time she finished the decryption, her hands were shaking. Stellar ignition suppression, T-40 years. She read it 4 times before her mind allowed the words to mean what they meant. 3 time zones and 1 very tired man away, Admiral Thomas Reyes was losing an argument with a committee that didn't understand what it was arguing about. Earth's Unified Defense Council had spent the last 2 hours debating budget allocations for a fleet, most of them still considered symbolic. Reyes sat at the end of the table, jaw tight, watching men and women in expensive suits treat the survival of the species like a line item. His aide slid a note across the table. Priority flag from Helios, HFY. Says it can't wait. Reyes had learned over 30 years of service that the messages which said they couldn't wait usually could. This one, something in the handwriting, in the way his aide's face had gone the color of old paper, told him otherwise. He left the meeting without excusing himself. Mireille's face filled the screen in his private office 20 minutes later, and she didn't waste time on pleasantries. She never did. That was one of the reasons he liked her, and one of the reasons the council found her insufferable. Admiral, I need you to look at something, and I need you to not tell me I'm imagining it. Go ahead. She sent the file. He watched the countdown resolve on his own screen, watched the timestamp behind it. Decades old, buried so deep it had been transmitting since before he'd joined the fleet, since before Mireille was born. 40 years, she said. Someone has been counting down the death of our son for 40 years, and nobody noticed because nobody was supposed to notice. This isn't a threat, Admiral. It's already in motion. Reyes said nothing for a long moment. He was thinking about a briefing he'd received as a young lieutenant 20 years ago, from a source inside the diplomatic corps who'd since disappeared without explanation. A single sentence, dismissed at the time as paranoid speculation. The old species don't fight the young ones. They just stop feeding them light. He'd filed it away as the kind of thing burned-out intelligence officers said after too many years watching an indifferent galaxy. Now it sat in his chest like a stone. Say it again, he told her. The suppression method. What causes a star to just stop? I don't know yet. But whatever it is, it doesn't announce itself. It doesn't invade. It doesn't declare war. Mireille's voice cracked just slightly, the first sign of fear she'd allowed herself since finding the signal. It just turns off the light and waits for everyone underneath it to die quietly, in the dark, without ever knowing why. Reyes didn't sleep that night. He sat alone in his office with the lights off, staring at star charts that suddenly felt like tombstones, and made the first of what would become hundreds of decisions nobody would thank him for. He opened a channel that didn't exist on any official registry, encrypted through 3 dead relay stations and one very illegal favor from an old friend in shipbuilding. When the line connected, he spoke without introducing himself, because the person on the other end already knew who he was. "We need to talk about the contingency." A pause. Then a voice, flat and careful. "Which one?" "The one we hoped we'd never need. Sol has a clock on it. 40 years, maybe less if they move up the timeline once they realize we're onto them." Reyes closed his eyes. "We start building, quietly, everywhere they aren't looking." "Building what exactly?" "An exit," Reyes said, "and something waiting on the other side of it, in case an exit isn't enough." He ended the call and sat with the weight of what he'd just started. 40 years, 2 generations, maybe 3, to move a fraction of humanity somewhere the Concord's endless. Patient eyes couldn't find them, without ever letting the wider galaxy, or the people being left behind, understand what was coming. Mireille's message blinked again on his console, one final line she'd added after their call ended, sent to him alone. "Admiral, I checked the origin coordinates on the suppression signal. It isn't broadcasting from somewhere out in Concord space. It's already here. Whatever is going to kill our sun, it's already inside our system, and it has been for years." Reyes stared at the star charts pinned across his wall, dozens of systems he'd never visited, marked in his own handwriting with names that meant nothing to anyone else yet. Haven's Reach. Second Dawn. Names for a future he hadn't built and couldn't guarantee. Outside his window, faint and steady and utterly unaware, the sun kept rising the way it always had. He wondered how many sunrises were left before someone, somewhere, finally reached out and switched it off. 40 years is a long time to keep a secret. It is not, however, long enough to grieve one. Captain Elena Voss stood on the observation deck of the colony ship Meridian's Hope, watching Earth shrink behind her for the last time, and told herself she wasn't crying. The nebula ahead swallowed starlight whole, a curtain of dust and gas so dense that sensors simply gave up trying to see through it. Somewhere inside that curtain was Haven's Reach, the home she had never seen, built by people she had never met, for a war she hadn't chosen but had inherited anyway. She had been 6 years old when Admiral Reyes first came to her family's door. She remembered his uniform more than his face, crisp, careful, the kind of uniform that made a child feel like the adult wearing it had everything under control. He didn't. Nobody did. But he was very good at pretending, and pretending, Elena had come to learn, was sometimes the only thing standing between order and panic. 22 years later, Reyes was dead, buried in an unmarked grave on a colony that didn't officially exist, and Elena commanded the very fleet he'd spent his life quietly assembling. The Exodus Fleet, 40,000 ships, built in secret over 4 decades, hidden in shell corporations and false registries, and the blind spots of a Concord too arrogant to imagine a species they'd already condemned might build something behind their backs. Captain, her second in command, a broad-shouldered man named Ferris, stepped up beside her. "Final transports through the veil. That's everyone." "Everyone who made it," Elena said quietly. She didn't need to elaborate. Every soul on this fleet understood the arithmetic. Earth's population, before the migration began, had been just over 11 billion. The number that left, spread across 4 decades of quiet departures careful enough to never trigger Concord's suspicion, was a fraction of that. A rounding error, dressed up as a miracle. The rest had stayed behind, not because they'd been abandoned. Reyes had insisted again and again in briefings Elena had sat through as a young officer who didn't yet understand what he meant. Because Earth needed to look inhabited, needed to look normal, needed to keep breathing, arguing, building, dying the way it always had, so that when the Concorde finally moved to end things, they would see exactly what they expected to see and nothing more. A decoy, built from billions of unknowing lives. Elena had never forgiven Reyes for that plan. She wasn't sure she ever would. Kyle found her an hour later in the training deck working through a combat sequence alone, movements sharp and controlled in a way that had nothing to do with exercise and everything to do with not screaming. He didn't announce himself. He never did. Kyle moved the way predators move, quiet even when he didn't need to be. A habit trained into him so early he no longer remembered a version of himself without it. He was Wraithborn. The word still made most people flinch, even those who'd grown up alongside the augmented soldiers built in humanity's last desperate decades before the Exodus. Faster reflexes, denser bone, a nervous system rewired to process combat data in fractions of a second no baseline human could match. He was also, Elena had come to understand over 3 years of fighting alongside him, one of the loneliest people she had ever met. "You're supposed to be resting," he said. "You're supposed to be somewhere else." "I was. Then I heard you punching a bag hard enough to wake the engineering deck." He leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "Bad memories or bad math?" Elena stopped, breathing hard, sweat dripping onto the deck plating. "Both. I keep doing the numbers. 11 billion people, Kyle. We saved maybe 200,000. That's not an exodus. That's a rescue boat that left almost everyone in the water." "Reyes didn't build a rescue boat," Kyle said. "He built a knife. You don't save a species by hiding all of it. You save it by hiding enough of it to come back and finish the fight." "That's supposed to comfort me?" "No." His voice was flat, honest in the way only Kale ever was. "It's supposed to be true. Comfort's not really my department." Despite herself, Elena laughed, short and tired. It was the first time she'd laughed in days. The moment didn't last. The alert came at 0217 fleet time, 3 days after the final ship crossed into the nebula's cover. Elena was on the bridge within 90 seconds, still pulling her jacket on, hair unbound for the first time in weeks. "Report," she snapped. The comms officer, a young woman named Priya who'd been 12 years old when her family boarded the Exodus fleet, looked up with an expression Elena had learned to dread. Not fear exactly. Something colder. "Solar telemetry from the Sol system, Captain. Relayed through the last civilian satellite we still have contact with." Priya's hands were steady, but her voice wasn't. "The sun's output just dropped. Not a flare, not an eclipse. The output curve is falling in a straight line, like something's throttling it deliberately." Elena's stomach turned to ice. "How long until it's noticeable from the surface?" "It already is, Captain. Earth's had 6 hours of dimming daylight, and people are starting to panic. There's no explanation, no warning. It's just happening." Elena stared at the screen, at the slow, deliberate death of a star that had warmed every generation of her species since the beginning of memory, and understood, with sudden and total clarity, why Reyes had spent his life preparing for this moment instead of trying to prevent it. Because there had never been a way to prevent it. Only a way to survive it. "Get me everything we have on Earth's surface defenses," she said, "and someone find out if Dr. Okafor's resistance network is still active down there. Because if the sun is dying and 11 billion people are about to find out why, I want to know if anyone left on that planet has a plan." Priya's hands moved across the console, and for a long moment, the bridge held its breath. Then the screen flickered, resolved into a single incoming transmission from Sol system, origin point Earth, encrypted in a cipher Elena hadn't seen used since Reyes's private briefings. The message was 11 seconds long. It ended in static. But in those 11 seconds, a voice Elena hadn't heard in 3 years, a voice she'd been told, officially, belonged to a woman who died in the early evacuation chaos, said 4 words that changed everything. "Elena, second dawn. Now." The sun did not go out. It went hungry. On Earth, people would later argue about the exact moment they knew something was wrong. The farmer in Nebraska who noticed his shadow had grown strange and soft at noon. The fishing crew off the coast of Kyushu who watched the horizon dim like a lamp running out of oil. The schoolchildren in Lago sent home early when the sky turned the color of old bruises. There was no single moment. There was only the slow, sick realization that daylight itself was rationing, and no government on the planet could explain why. Dr. Mireille Okafor had known for 6 hours before the rest of the world caught up, and she had spent every one of those hours preparing for exactly this. She was 71 years old now, her hands not as steady as they'd once been, her eyes needing help to read the fine data scrolling across her makeshift lab. A converted shipping container buried 3 levels beneath what used to be a university physics department kept running on salvaged power cells and sheer stubbornness. She had stayed behind when the Exodus fleet departed, not out of duty, though there was plenty of that, but because someone needed to keep watching the sky, and she had never trusted anyone else to watch it as carefully as she did. "Talk to me," she said, not looking up from her console. Behind her, a younger man named Dabir, one of maybe 40 people who made up what remained of her resistance network, scientists and engineers who'd chosen to stay for reasons as varied and stubborn as her own, read from a secondary screen. "Solar output's down 11% and falling. The suppression signature matches what you flagged 4 decades ago, but it's stronger now, more concentrated." Concentrated how? Like whatever's doing this isn't broadcasting from a distance anymore. It's close, inside the heliosphere close. Mireille finally looked up. "They moved equipment into our own solar system and nobody noticed." "Or," Dabir said carefully, "it's been here the whole time, waiting." The thought settled over the room like dust. 40 years of quiet observation, 40 years of Mireille assuring herself the countdown gave humanity time to prepare. And the whole time, the mechanism of their extinction might have already been sitting quietly among them, patient as a held breath. She thought of Ray as dead 6 years now, buried on a colony most of the people currently panicking on Earth's surface didn't know existed. He'd once told her during one of their last conversations before the Exodus fleet departed that the hardest part of the plan wasn't building the fleet or hiding the colony. It was trusting that the sacrifice would mean something, that the billions left behind on Earth unknowing would still matter in the end. Not as decoys, but as the reason any of this was worth doing at all. "We're not letting this planet die in the dark without a fight," Mireille said. "Get me a channel to the Exodus fleet. Full priority Reyes's old cipher. And Dabir, pull everything we have on the Concord suppression tech. If they're throttling the sun instead of destroying it outright, that means there's a mechanism. Mechanisms can be broken." 11 light minutes and a lifetime away, Elena Voss stared at the 4 words on her console and felt the floor of her certainty give out beneath her. Elena. Second dawn. Now. "That's not possible," she said, echoing, without knowing it, the exact words Mireille had spoken 40 years earlier in a very different room. "Okafor died in the second wave of evacuations. I read the report myself. Apparently the report was wrong," Cale said. He'd arrived on the bridge without being summoned, drawn by the same instinct that always pulled him toward danger before anyone had to ask. Or it was supposed to be wrong. "Reyes buried a lot of things, Captain. Maybe he buried a person too." Elena pulled up Reyes's private archive, the one she'd inherited along with his command, the one she still hadn't finished reading 4 years after his death. Buried under 17 layers of encryption she'd never had reason to break was a file she'd assumed was corrupted data, dated the same week as his death. It wasn't corrupted. It had simply been waiting for the right authorization code, and Mireille's transmission had just provided it. The file opened. It wasn't text. It was a recording. Reyes, younger than Elena had ever seen him, sitting in an office she didn't recognize, speaking to a camera with the careful, deliberate cadence of a man who knew he was leaving instructions for people who wouldn't understand them for decades. "If you're watching this, it means Sewell has gone dark, and Mireille is still alive to confirm it, which means the plan worked, at least this far." Reyes's recorded face was tired in a way Elena had never seen in life. "Haven's Reach was never the end of this, Elena. It was the beginning. Second Dawn is the next part, and I couldn't tell you what it is because if the Conquered ever suspected it existed, they would have burned the whole system down looking for it instead of just starving the sun." He paused, and for a moment, The recording seemed almost to look directly at her. "You're going to want to know why I never told you. The answer is simple. Some secrets aren't meant to protect the enemy from finding out. They're meant to protect the people carrying them from the weight of knowing too soon." The recording ended. Elena sat in silence for a long moment, the bridge crew watching her, waiting. "Ferris," she said finally, voice steady despite everything. "Pull every archive Reyes left in this system. Founding documents, supply manifests, anything with his authorization codes on it. I want to know what Second Dawn is before the Concord figures out we're looking for it. And if we can't find it in time..." Elena looked at the tactical display, at the dimming light readings streaming in from a sun 11 light minutes away, dying in slow motion in front of 11 billion people who had no idea help was even a possibility. "Then we find it anyway," she said. "Because right now it's the only lead we have, and Earth doesn't have 40 years left to wait for a better one." 3 hours later, Ferris found it. Not in the founding archives, which held nothing but supply logs and colony blueprints, but in a place no one had thought to look. A maintenance log for a decommissioned survey ship, filed under a project designation buried so deep in bureaucratic noise it looked like a clerical error. Project Second Dawn. Location, classified, Reyes authorization only. Status, active. Active, Elena repeated. It's still running. After all this time, it's still running. "There's a location tag," Ferris said, voice tight with something between disbelief and dread. "Captain, this can't be right. I've cross-referenced it 3 times. "Where?" Ferris turned the screen toward her, and Elena felt the same cold certainty she'd felt 3 days earlier, watching Earth's daylight begin to fail for reasons no one understood. The coordinates weren't out in deep space, hidden among the stars where a secret project should logically be. They pointed inward, toward the heart of the one place in the galaxy no one, not Elena, not the Concorde, not anyone, would ever think to search. They pointed at the sun. Nobody builds anything inside a star. That was the first thing every engineer on Haven's Reach told Elena when she showed them the coordinates. And it was also, she would later realize, exactly the kind of impossible thing Reyes had spent his whole career proving wrong. The colony's command chamber was crowded in a way it rarely was. Not just Elena's senior officers, but council representatives, engineers, and standing near the back with her arms folded and an expression that gave away nothing, a woman most of the room still didn't fully trust. Ambassador Thessaly Vren had arrived at Haven's Reach 11 years earlier, walking out of an escape pod with Concord markings and a story nobody wanted to believe. That she had defected, alone, from a species that considered defection a kind of madness. She'd spent a decade proving her loyalty in small, careful ways, translating intercepted Concord communications, warning of patrol movements before they happened, never once asking for anything in return except to be believed. Elena still wasn't sure she trusted her, but right now she was the only person in the room who understood how the Concord actually thought, and that made her useful whether Elena liked it or not. "You want my opinion?" Thessaly said before anyone asked for it. "The coordinates aren't a mistake. A star's core is the one place your admiral could hide something the Concorde would never scan. Their suppression technology throttles a star's output. It doesn't inspect its interior. Why would they? No one builds anything inside a sun. It would be insane." "So Reyes was insane," Kyle said from the corner. "Reyes," Thessaly said, "understood something most species never learn about yours. Humans don't ask whether something is possible. You ask whether it's necessary, and then you find a way to make the impossible true anyway. It's the most dangerous thing about you, and until recently the Concorde considered it a joke." "Recently?" Elena asked. Thessaly's expression flickered just slightly. "Recently some of them have stopped laughing." The debate that followed lasted 6 hours and settled nothing cleanly. Half the council wanted to stay hidden, insisting Haven's Reach had survived this long by avoiding exactly the kind of bold, visible action that investigating Second Dawn would require. The other half, led quietly by Elena, argued that hiding had never been the plan. It had been the preparation, and pretending otherwise was a betrayal of everything Reyes had sacrificed to build. In the end, it wasn't the council that decided. It was a report from the colony's outer sensor net, delivered mid-argument by a visibly shaken junior officer. Concord scout ships. 3 of them, moving slow and methodical through the nebula's outer dust clouds, exactly the kind of patient, patternless search a species with unlimited time would conduct. "They're not here by accident," Thessaly said quietly. "Something led them to this system. A leak, a trace signature, a mistake. It doesn't matter which. What matters is they're looking, and eventually, they'll find something." Elena made the only decision that made sense. "We're not waiting for eventually. Kyle, assemble a strike team. If those scouts confirm our position, I want them gone before they can transmit it back to their command." Kale was already moving before she finished the sentence. The engagement, when it came, lasted 4 minutes and changed the shape of the war forever. Kale led 6 Wraithborn soldiers through the nebula's dust in 3 modified interceptors, moving with the kind of coordinated, silent precision that had taken years of brutal training to build. The Concord scouts were fast, their weapons calibrated for the slower reflexes of younger species, their tactics built on decades of easy victories against enemies who'd never learned to fight back properly. They had never fought Wraithborn soldiers before. Kyle's interceptor closed the distance in 11 seconds, weapon systems already tracking before the Concord ship had finished registering the threat. He felt the augmentation take over the way it always did in combat. The strange, quiet stillness at the center of his mind, while his body moved faster than conscious thought allowed, reflexes stitched together from the desperate genetic engineering of a species that had run out of easier options. The first Concord ship went down without firing a shot. The second managed a single, panicked volley before Kale's team overwhelmed its shields. The third tried to run. Kale caught it anyway. When the wreckage settled and the confirmation came back to Haven's reach, 3 Concord scouts destroyed, 0 human casualties, no transmission escaped the engagement zone, the celebration on the bridge was short-lived. Because everyone in that room understood the same uncomfortable truth, Thessaly voiced aloud a moment later. "They'll notice 3 scouts going silent," she said. "And when they investigate, they'll find a species that shouldn't exist anymore fighting like one that's just getting started. You didn't just win a skirmish, Captain. You just told the Conquered humanity survived, and that it's stronger than they ever imagined." Elena felt the weight of that settle over her, the terrible knowledge that the clock, already running, had just started running faster. It was Mireille's second transmission, arriving through Earth's last surviving relay network 18 hours later, that finally cracked the mystery open completely. She looked older than the last time Elena had seen her, worn down by decades of hiding and a sun that continued its slow, deliberate collapse above her. But her voice, when the message played, carried the same sharp certainty it always had. "Elena, if you found Second Dawn's coordinates, you already know where it points. I need you to understand something before you go there, because I don't think Reyes ever told you the full reason he built it." She paused, glancing at something off-screen, then continued. 40 years ago, before the Exodus began, a research team of 9 people volunteered for what we all believed at the time was a suicide mission. A deep survey vessel, launched into the sun's outer convective zone, meant to study stellar behavior at a range no ship had ever survived. We held a memorial for them 18 months later, when contact was lost and search efforts turned up nothing. Mireille's eyes, tired and fierce, found the camera directly. "I don't think that memorial was ever necessary. I think Reyes faked their deaths the same way he faked the Exodus's failure. Because if the Concord believed we'd already lost 9 of our best minds to the sun's own hostility, they would never think to look for what those 9 people might have built there instead, hidden in plain sight for 40 years. The transmission cut abruptly, replaced by a final decrypted string of coordinates and a single decoded phrase pulled from Second Dawn's buried activation log. The first hard confirmation of what waited at the heart of Saul. Second Dawn status, construction complete. Fleet integrity, 97%. Awaiting Reyes protocol authorization. Elena read the words 3 times, feeling the shape of the last 4 decades rearrange itself around her. Not a research station, not a colony, not a message buried for sentiment's sake. A fleet, built inside the dying sun itself. By 9 people, the rest of humanity had mourned as dead, waiting nearly 40 years for someone to finally come and wake it up. No ship had ever survived a direct approach to a star's convective zone. Elena's was about to become the second. The Meridian's hope shuddered as it crossed the outer threshold of Soul's corona, hull plating glowing a dull, furious orange despite shielding systems engineers had assured her would hold. Kyle stood beside her on the bridge, jaw tight, watching temperature readouts climb toward numbers that shouldn't have been survivable. Thessaly stood on her other side, silent, studying the sun's suppressed light with an expression Elena had never seen on her before. Something close to awe. "The suppression field is thinner here," Thessaly said finally. "Closer to the source. Whatever's throttling this star, it's not designed to stop something from moving through its interior. It was only ever meant to starve the outside." "Meaning?" "Meaning your admiral didn't just hide a fleet in the one place the Concorde would never look. He hid it in the one place their own weapon couldn't reach." Elena allowed herself for the first time in days a small and painful flicker of hope. It didn't last. On Earth, the diversion began at dawn, a dawn that barely deserved the name anymore, the sky the color of dying embers, the world beneath it holding its breath in a way that had nothing to do with weather. Mireille stood in the ruined observatory that had once been her university's pride, now little more than scaffolding and salvaged power cells, watching the last of her resistance network prepare for a fight none of them expected to win. "You don't have to lead this," Dabir said quietly, checking the charge on a weapon that had been decommissioned before he was born. "Let someone younger take the front line." "I've spent 40 years watching this happen from a safe distance," Mireille said. "I'm done watching." The plan was simple in the way desperate plans often are. Concorde monitoring satellites had detected unusual activity near Sol's surface, faint, impossible readings that shouldn't exist inside an actively suppressed star, and a response fleet was already moving to investigate. If that fleet reached the sun before Elena's team activated Second Dawn, 40 years of secrecy would collapse in an instant. Mireille's resistance couldn't stop a conquered fleet, but they could make noise. Enough noise in enough places across Earth's surface, using every scrap of salvaged tech and stubborn defiance they had left, to convince conquered sensors that the real threat was here, on the ground, rather than at the heart of the star above them. It worked exactly as well and exactly as terribly as she'd expected. The Concorde response fleet split its attention, diverting a third of its ships toward Earth's surface to investigate the sudden flare of unauthorized activity, buying Elena's team precious, priceless hours. Mireille watched the diversion succeed from a rooftop overlooking what remained of her city, static and smoke rising around her, and allowed herself a single, quiet moment of pride before the first Concorde strike hit the block 2 streets over. She didn't run. She'd never planned to. Her final transmission, sent in the last seconds before the observatory came down around her, was short, addressed to Elena, carrying no fear at all, only the same fierce certainty that had defined every year of her life since she first found a countdown hidden in stellar noise. "Whatever's waiting for you in there, it's worth what this cost. Finish it, Elena. Make it count." Inside the sun, the Meridian's hope found what 9 forgotten scientists had spent 4 decades building, and the sight of it stole the breath from everyone on the bridge. A megastructure vast beyond anything human engineering had ever attempted, suspended in a stabilized pocket carved from the star's own convective currents, drawing power directly from Sol's suppressed but still burning core. Around it, arranged in silent, disciplined formation, waited a fleet, sleek, unfamiliar, built from technology that Elena recognized with a jolt of vertigo as a hybrid of human design and something unmistakably conquered in origin. "They didn't just hide from the suppression tech," Cale said quietly, staring at the scale of it. "They reverse-engineered it. They turned the weapon meant to kill us into the thing that saves us," Elena said, half to herself, understanding at last the full, staggering scope of what Reyes had spent his life building. A voice answered her, not from her crew, but from the structure itself, an aging AI system that had waited, patient and unblinking, for 40 years for exactly this moment. Fleet online, awaiting Reyes protocol authorization. The voice paused, and when it spoke again, there was something almost human in its careful, measured tone. He said you'd come, Captain Voss. He said you'd be ready. Are you? Elena stood in the heart of the sun that had raised her species and nearly ended it, surrounded by the ghosts of 9 people the world believed dead and the impossible fleet they'd built in secret, and felt the full weight of Reyes's 40-year gamble settle onto her shoulders alone. Behind her, the tactical display flickered, an incoming alert cutting through the moment like a blade. The Concorde's main battle fleet, alerted by the diversion on Earth and the destroyed scouts near Haven's Reach, had finally traced the pattern back to its source. They were entering the system. All of them. Elena looked at Kale, then at Thessaly, then at the silent, waiting fleet stretched out before her. Humanity's answer to 40 years of quiet extinction, built inside the one place their enemy had never thought to search. Authorization. Reyes protocol, Voss command override, she said, her voice steady despite the storm rising in her chest. Wake them up. The structure around them hummed, ancient systems stirring to life after 4 silent decades, and for the first time since the sun began to die, humanity's hidden fleet began, slowly and inexorably, to move. The sun had been silent for 40 years. It was about to speak. Elena felt the Meridian's hope shudder as the hidden fleet around her stirred fully to life. Hull after hull igniting with power drawn straight from Sol's suppressed core. 40 years of patient construction finally answering the only call it had ever been built to answer. On the tactical display, the Concorde's main battle fleet poured into the system. Dozens of capital ships arranged with the calm, contemptuous confidence of a species that had never once lost this kind of fight. They didn't know yet that they already had. All ships. This is Voss, Elena said, her voice carrying across a fleet that had waited 4 decades to hear a human command. I know most of you have never taken orders from me. I know most of you have never taken orders from anyone, because you've been asleep since before I was old enough to understand what you were. But you were built for exactly this moment, and that moment is now. Follow my lead, and let's show them why they were afraid of us in the first place. The response came not in words, but in motion. Hundreds of ships breaking formation in perfect, practiced unity. A fleet with no living crew moving with the discipline of soldiers who had trained for a war they never got to fight, until now. Kale's voice cut through the calm from his own interceptor, sharp with the particular calm he only ever found in combat. Wraithborn strike teams launching. Captain, permission to make this personal. Granted, Elena said. Make it count. The battle that followed would later be studied by 3 separate civilizations, none of whom fully believed their own sensor logs. Kale led his strike teams directly into the heart of the Concorde formation. Wraithborn reflexes turning what should have been a suicidal charge into a scalpel-precise dismantling of their forward shield network. Thessaly, seated at a secondary tactical station Elena had grudgingly granted her hours earlier, fed the fleet a stream of intercepted Concord authentication codes, turning the enemy's own defensive protocols into brief, fatal windows of confusion. They're not adapting, Thessaly said, disbelief coloring her voice even as she worked. They don't know how. The Concord hasn't fought a real war in centuries. They've only ever delivered verdicts. Then let's give them something they've never seen, Elena said. A defense. On Earth, in the observatory's ruins, the last fragments of Mireille's network, survivors of the diversion, wounded but alive, watched the sky change color for the 2nd time in a week. This time, it wasn't dimming. Sol's core, fed by the reversed flow of captured stellar energy pouring back in from Second Dawn's fleet, began, impossibly, to brighten. A young technician named Priya, patched into Earth's surviving orbital defense grid through a signal relay Mireille had spent her final hours restoring, watched decades-old planetary defenses flicker awake across the globe. Systems Reyes had quietly funded and hidden inside civilian infrastructure so thoroughly that even most governments had forgotten they existed. Earth, it turned out, had never been entirely defenseless. It had simply been waiting for permission to fight back. The conquered fleet's retreat began quietly, then all at once. First a handful of damaged ships breaking formation, then entire battle groups, their command structure unraveling under an assault they had no framework for understanding. They had come expecting to finish erasing a species too young and too fragile to notice its own extinction. Instead, they found themselves facing a fleet built from their own stolen technology, a star fighting to relight itself, and soldiers who fought like something built specifically to survive them. The order to withdraw, when it finally came, was the first full retreat in recorded Concord history. Elena watched their ships scatter into the dark, watched the tactical display empty of enemy contacts one by one, and felt something inside her chest finally, cautiously, begin to unclench. "Captain." Ferris's voice quiet with disbelief. "They're gone. All of them. It's over." It wasn't. Not really. Not the war. Not the questions. Not the grief that Elena knew was still waiting for her the moment she allowed herself to feel it. But for the first time in 40 years, the sun above Sol system burned a little brighter than it had the day before, and somewhere on a ruined rooftop on Earth, survivors who had spent a week believing their world was ending looked up and saw daylight returning. Alone in her quarters that night, Elena finally opened the last file in Reyes's private archive, one she'd been avoiding since his death, marked simply, "For Elena, after." His recorded face was older here, closer to how she remembered him at the end, tired but unbroken. If you're watching this, it means the fleet woke up, and the Concorde learned something they should have understood from the beginning, that humanity was never going to just survive the dark. We were always going to find a way to outshine it. He paused, and for a moment the careful command mask slipped, leaving only an old man who had spent his life carrying a secret too heavy for any one person. "I couldn't tell you everything, Elena, not because I didn't trust you, because I needed you to become someone who could carry this weight before you knew how heavy it was. I think you have. I think Mireille always believed you would too." His voice caught, just slightly. "I'm sorry I won't be there to see what you build next, but I know it'll be something the galaxy remembers." The recording ended. Helena sat in the quiet of her quarters for a long time, grief and pride tangled together in a way she suspected would never fully separate, and thought of Mireille's last transmission, and of 9 forgotten scientists who'd spent 40 years building hope inside a dying star, and of a fleet that had waited its entire existence for someone to finally believe in it enough to wake it up. Outside her window, Seoul burned steady and warm, brighter than it had been in a week, brighter, some said, than it had been in years. Across the galaxy, in listening posts and diplomatic chambers belonging to species who had never once considered humanity a threat worth watching, a single message began quietly circulating, passed from one wary observer to the next, carrying the same simple, unmistakable warning. They shut down the sun. Humanity had already escaped. And then they came back and lit it again. Elena Voss stood at the viewport of the Meridian's Hope, her fleet, humanity's fleet, arrayed in silent formation around a sun that had tried to die and failed. And for the first time since the countdown had first appeared in a lonely research station 40 years ago, she let herself believe that whatever came next, humanity would not be facing it alone, unseen, or unafraid. They would be facing it in the light.